All right, so I'm recording this on August 8th in the morning. So any games that happen later today won't be included in this podcast. But on this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast, I'm going to be ranking the 22 bubble teams as a power ranking because there's been some interesting outcomes so far in the small amount of games that we've seen, and there's been a lot of good basketball so far. The NBA deserves a lot of credit for putting this all together. Before I do that, though, I'm going to go over my player awards for the 2019-2020 season. And so starting out with MVP, for me it's Giannis, and I don't really fully understand the LeBron argument from like a basketball perspective. I feel like Giannis has been the best player in the NBA, like head and shoulders this season. To me, there's really not much debate that Giannis is the best player in the league right now. When you look at what he does defensively as well as offensively, he's the most efficient scorer, a great defender. The only thing that LeBron has over Giannis is that LeBron has more assists. He led the league in assists this year. I think the other thing that works in favor of Giannis is that the Bucks have had a better record than the Lakers, and they currently have a better record. They're on pace for more wins. Now, granted, they do play in an easier conference, but I think there's a case to be made that Giannis is actually, the best player by far on a weaker supporting cast, and yet the team that he's on is better. LeBron still has Anthony Davis. As much as you might not like the 7th or 8th best guy on the Lakers roster, Davis makes up for a lot. Giannis doesn't have that second awesome scoring partner, and yet this Bucks team is historically good. They're beating teams on average by 10.8 points per game. This Bucks team is really similar in terms of its output to some of those Golden State Warriors teams that were just unbelievably good the past few years. So Giannis isn't just the best player on a really good team, he's the best player on a historically good team. He's arguably one of the best defensive players in the league. I would say he's the best offensive player in the league right now. He's improved his shooting. His three-point percentage has gone up by about 5% from last year, and I think he's only getting better. So to me, the LeBron argument sort of rests on LeBron being the best story this year. And sometimes the MVP doesn't always go to the right person. I feel like there's been some times in the past where one guy might have a better story than someone else, and sort of a media narrative will get written and someone will win the MVP. But, this year it should be Giannis. Again, the only argument for LeBron is that he's got the most assists of any player in the league. He's on a good team, and it would be like a makeup call, sort of, where you could say, well, LeBron should have probably won a couple more MVPs along the way. We don't want to give it to Giannis again. Let's give it to LeBron this time. And to me, that's a bad reason. I think Giannis has been the best player. So I do have LeBron second. And then, for my ballot personally, and for my top 5, I've got Harden third. I've got Kawhi fourth and Lillard fifth. I think you could talk me into Kawhi going, one spot higher or lower. I personally have a hard time kind of, squaring the idea of like missing games being a problem. I know he's resting his body so that he's ready for the finals, which I think is actually a good thing in the long run. I'm cool with Kawhi taking off however many games he wants to in the regular season, as long as he's ready for the games that count more. I'm cool with any player doing that, actually. But, it's tough when you get into the MVP discussion when guys on different teams are, playing all the games. But Kawhi really has been playing awesome basketball. Some of his best basketball has actually been in a Clipper uniform, which is kind of surprising. You know, Lillard being thrown in at number 5, I guess, is a little bit questionable, but I know he was on a terrible team for most of the year. But to me, he really is one of like the 7 best players in the league right now, in my opinion. And when you consider the word value, it's hard for me to look away from Lillard and how much he brings that Blazers team upward. You know, that team would be terrible without him, I think. For Defensive Player of the Year, I'm also giving it to Giannis. I think he's the best candidate for it. And the only reason why I wouldn't give it to Kawhi is because Kawhi probably, I think, like the games played thing matters a little bit. And then, of course, Kawhi is just so smart. I think he knows that he's not going to turn it on and play his absolute best defense until it's round 2, round 3 of the playoffs. And so Kawhi, you know, he's smart about when he wants to play elite defense, a little bit like LeBron used to do. But of course, I think Kawhi at his best is a better defender than LeBron ever was. So, you know, Kawhi, I think you could make the argument's the best defender in the league. But as far as this Defensive Player of the Year, you know, with opponents' field goal percentages being as low as they are against Giannis, I just think that Giannis has to be the choice, especially with all the blocks. He can defend around the rim. He can be moved around. He's very versatile. And I'm going to give the MVP and Defensive Player of the Year to Giannis. So for Rookie of the Year, I don't really see too much of a debate. I'm giving it to Ja Morant because Zion didn't play in very many games. And, you know, I think that there would be an outside shot of Zion winning if the Pelicans had overtaken the Grizzlies for the 8th seed when Zion got healthy. But, you know, that doesn't look like it's going to happen. And then, of course, you're supposed to not factor in the bubble action, which, you know, it's kind of hard not to factor that in. But, you know, Ja has been the most consistent available rookie this year. I think Zion only had 19 games or so when the season stopped. I think, you know, you could make the argument that Zion was better per game than Ja, but if it's that small of an amount of games, it's hard to give that person Rookie of the Year. So I'm going to give it to Ja Morant. 6th Man of the Year. It's, you know, kind of a less interesting debate. I think it's, you know, you can look at Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams. I decided to give it to Harrell because I think that he's a little bit more important to the Clippers than Lou Williams is, just because Williams is not being relied upon as a scorer as much as he was in the past couple of years. But yeah, I mean, this one's not as interesting of a debate. Most Improved Player is an interesting one. There's a lot of good candidates. I narrowed it down to Brandon Ingram, Bam Adebayo, and Jason Tatum. So let's start with Brandon Ingram. He played about the same amount of minutes this year as he did last year. His field goal percentage actually went down by about 3%, but his three-point percentage went up from 33% to 39%. His attempts for three-pointers per game went from 2 to around 6. His free throw percentage went from 67.5% to 85%. And his points per game went from 18 to close to 24 points per game. So really big improvements across the board from Ingram. Bam Adebayo, his points per game went from about 9 to around 16. His assists per game went from 2.2 to 5.1. And I think you could make the argument that he's become quite an interesting ball handling center as well as a very versatile defender. Not all of Adebayo's value is shown in the stats. And then third, I have Tatum here, about the same amount of minutes this year as last year. His three-point attempts went up from 4 to 7, and his three-point percentage went from around 37% to 40%. His points per game went from 15.7 to 23.3. So Tatum's been taking smarter shots. He's definitely evolved as a player. I think you could make the argument he's one of the top 20 guys in the league now, which is a big step up for him. This was a tough one. I think all three are really good candidates, and there's actually a few other guys who, were very improved that didn't even make the top three. After a lot of consideration, I decided to go with Bam Adebayo because I feel a little bit like Ingram had big stats, bad team at the beginning of the year. And Ingram's field goal percentage did go down by about 3%, which, kind of was reflected because of the volume increase with his shooting. I just wish that the Pelicans were a successful team when Ingram was the best player. It seemed like the Pelicans weren't a successful team until Zion got there. And when you look at the supporting cast, they did have Holiday and Lonzo and Redick. I don't think the team was that bad on paper, even without Zion. And I just felt like the team wasn't very successful. It's a tough, close debate here, but Bam Adebayo, I think you could argue, is the most important player on a really good team. He might not be the overall best player, but I think that if the Miami Heat picked one guy who they didn't want to lose for this upcoming playoffs, it would be Bam over guys like Jimmy Butler, even guys like Duncan Robinson. And so with that in mind, I think Adebayo just being the most important player on a team that was really successful, on pace for around 50 wins. I just think the things he does defensively as well as offensively, a lot of it is not shown in the stat line. So I'm going to go with Adebayo for now. Nothing against Tatum or Ingram. I think the long-term ceiling of Ingram is a really high one, actually. And of course, I feel the same way about Tatum. But I think just in terms of improvement, Adebayo really became something that I think no one thought he could have become. Okay, and finally, we've got head coach of the year. I'm going to give it to Nick Nurse. I think the Raptors deserve some kind of credit for what they've pulled through here, losing Kawhi and still being awesome. They were on pace for 59 wins when the season stopped, which is really remarkable. This team has done a great job of developing players. Guys just are plugged in and they can play well in this system. OG Anunoby, Terrence Davis, two very improved young players. Terrence Davis actually a rookie, undrafted player. And this team is just not dependent on any one person, and yet they persevere through losing first DeRozan and then, of course, losing Kawhi. I just think this team has been really impressive every time I watch them. They have a lot of resiliency. The other two head coaches that I was giving strong considerations to were Budenholzer and Vogel. Obviously, the two coaches are the two most successful by record teams in the NBA. But there were a lot of good coaching seasons this year. There were even a few guys who didn't get into the top three that I thought were very deserving. Okay, so now moving on to the power rankings of the 22 NBA bubble teams that are still remaining. So this ranking is going to be who do I think is most likely to win the title down to who's least likely to win the title. So number one is the team that I think is going to be most likely to win the title. So I'm going to start at 22. I'm going with the Wizards. They were 24-40 when the season stopped, on pace for 31 wins. They have been 0-5 so far in the bubble. And keep in mind, I'm recording this on August 8th in the morning, so the games today aren't going to be factored into the records I'm saying, but just keep in mind that in case this video gets put out a day later. Anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time on the Wizards. They are looking at some younger guys: Thomas Bryant, Rui Hachimura, Troy Brown. as well as maybe Jerome Robinson. Some of their younger players have been getting minutes. I don't think the Wizards' future is particularly bright, but they are missing their 3 best players at the moment. So, yeah, they're just kind of hanging around back here. At 21, I've actually got Brooklyn. So they were on pace for 38.5 wins when the season stopped. They've been 3-2 since the bubble started, which is really surprising because I actually didn't know most of Brooklyn's roster when I looked at their first game. Their new big 3 is Caris LeVert, Joe Harris, and Jarrett Allen, which is kind of strange. Most of their bench I just am not familiar with. I think they've got a lot of young players being tested out. They have gone 3-2 so far, but, I don't know. I just don't see them making any noise. I think if they were in the West, they would be probably the worst team. At number 20, I've got Orlando, just 1 spot ahead of Brooklyn. Orlando 30-35 when the season stopped, on pace for 38 wins. They've been 2-3 so far in the bubble. I just think Orlando's a really weird team. They're better defensively than offensively, but in the NBA, offense is so much more important than defense. I think their 2 best players right now are probably Vucevic and Aaron Gordon. They're still looking to get more out of Markelle Fultz. I just think it's a really weird team that doesn't really have enough scoring for my liking. At 19, I've got Sacramento. When the season stopped, they were 28-36, on pace for 36 wins, and they've been 1-4 so far in the bubble. I'm a little bit disappointed with the Kings. I thought they would be a little bit more frisky. They've lost a couple close games, but I'm always looking for more from them for some reason. They just have a lot of guys who I like. When you look at their crunch time 5, it's De'Aaron Fox, Buddy Hield, Bogdanovic has been good. They've even got other guys who I like, Bjelica, and Richaun Holmes isn't a bad player. I feel like Luke Walton isn't that bad of a coach, and yet this team just sort of feels flat a lot. They don't impress me as much as I want them to. I sort of always feel like this team should be a little bit more cohesive. They're definitely really bad defensively. And so I think I'm going to tentatively say they're the worst team in the West right now who's still remaining. I don't think that I would have said that before the bubble started, but right now they've been pretty sloppy so far. At 18, I've got Phoenix. When the season stopped, they were 26-39, only on pace for 33 wins, but they've actually been 4-0 since the bubble started. The last remaining undefeated team is the Phoenix Suns, which to me, I had to do a double take. I looked at that and I was shocked, but it's true. So the Suns have been playing better lately. Congrats to them for getting into this. They've been bad for a long time. And their roster isn't that bad right now. They actually have a starting 5 that makes sense. Oubre hasn't even been playing with them, but if the Suns were fully healthy, their starting 5 actually isn't that bad. They've got Rubio, Booker, Michael Bridges, Oubre, and DeAndre Ayton, which I think is actually a pretty likable group of 5 that kind of meshes well together. They don't have a great bench. Saric is their best bench player, I think, but this team isn't that bad now, and it's showing a little bit more now in their results. 17th, I've got San Antonio. When the season stopped, they were 27-36, on pace for 35 wins, and they've been 3-2 so far in the bubble. I think the Spurs have looked fine. They are just sort of this team that continues to show up and, look competent. They're clearly not good enough, I think, to be a team that makes any noise, but I think that it's respectable how they've looked so far. DeRozan's been all right. Derek White has really been, I think, the best player on this team top to bottom. And, as usual with the Spurs, I feel like they're getting a lot more than you'd expect considering the roster they've got right now. At number 16, I've got Memphis. They were 32 and 33, on pace for 40.5 wins when the season stopped, and since the bubble started, they've been a disappointing 1-4, losing a couple games there to some teams they really needed to beat. I think Memphis right now looks like they're going to probably be able to hang on to at least the opportunity to be in a play-in game, but they've been a little bit disappointing so far. I think even with the disappointment so far, they have a really bright future with Triple J, and Dylan Brooks. I think they've got a really good young nucleus. They also haven't been playing with Tyus Jones or Justice Winslow so far in the bubble, so those are a couple pieces that I think would have helped them out a little bit. But overall, I think Memphis, should generally be excited about the direction they're going in. Just ahead of the Grizzlies, I've got the Pelicans at 15. When the season stopped, they were 28 and 36, on pace for 36 wins. They've been 2-3 so far in the bubble. They've been a little bit reluctant to play Zion big minutes so far, which I think is fine. If they want to ease him into it, I think that's fine just for his long-term benefit. It seemed like everybody wanted New Orleans to be that team to sneak in and challenge Memphis, but I think very clearly that team has been Portland. The Pelicans have a really bright future too. You look at their young group: Zion, Ingram, Lonzo, Drew Holiday. They've got a lot of good players, and they've got kind of an interesting, unique lineup. I think they'll be a curious team for the 2020-2021 season. At number 14, I've got Utah. So this is the 8th ranked team I have from Western Conference teams on this list. I feel like Utah has just disintegrated a little bit. Obviously, Bojan Bogdanovic not being there is a big loss. Mike Conley has been a little bit of a disappointment, although he had a couple bright spots since the bubble started, had a couple nice moments. I just feel like this team has kind of shifted to being a little too reliant on Donovan Mitchell. And unfortunately for the Jazz, and this is why, I wouldn't vote for Gobert as Defensive Player of the Year, is that, Gobert really isn't going to be playable in a lot of series. There's going to be a lot of matchups that Gobert is not going to be favorable against. Specifically, if they get matched up with Houston, I think that's going to be just a fireworks show for the Rockets. I don't know what the Jazz are going to do about that. I really like Quinn Snyder. I think he's done a great job, but in a weird way, I feel like this team lacks a little bit of firepower. I think that they just seem a little bit more similar to what they were maybe 3 years ago than what they've been the past 2 seasons, including what they were this year before the season stopped. They were actually on pace for 52.5 wins. They've been 2-3 since the bubble started. I think Utah, I'm going to say tentatively, is probably going to be the weakest team that qualifies for the playoffs in the Western Conference. So at 13, I've got Philadelphia. When the season stopped, they were 39 and 26, on pace for 49 wins, and they've been 3-1 since the bubble started. So I'm always pretty low on Philadelphia. I'm not all that surprised by what's happened to them this year. It always comes back to the same couple things for me with the Sixers. Embiid and Simmons are both super talented, and yet the presence of the other diminishes each of them. They're not a good basketball fit. It's a wonky basketball fit. And the other thing is that I actually don't think this team has that good of a roster. I think their roster is a little bit overrated, especially, when you contextualize it and say, well, Embiid and Simmons are kind of not a match for each other. We need to, stagger their minutes a little bit because we don't want Embiid, out on the perimeter, as far away from the basket as possible, which is, exactly what every other team who's playing Philadelphia wants them to do. I just don't think there's enough shooting on this team. I think Josh Richardson's been a big disappointment. Horford has taken a big step backwards. I think Tobias Harris, as much as he's a solid third player, is one of the worst contracts in the league very quietly. He's, making, I think, like $38 million per year. I don't see it with him all the time. I think they overpaid for him by a lot. They've established a few bench guys. The two guys they traded for from Golden State, Glenn Robinson and Alec Burks, have been all right. Korkmaz has had some moments where he's been okay. People are excited about Thibault, but overall, I think this Sixers team is dysfunctional. I think they're poorly coached. I think Brown is just, I think I've seen enough to know that he's not that smart of a coach. As much as certain Sixers fans might want to push back on that, it shows that this team is just so inconsistent. They're very talented, but for me, I always thought the hype before this season started for them was kind of weird. I don't know why people thought they were going to be some kind of NBA Finals contender or maybe even a potential champion. I don't see it with them. I think this team is going to blow up at some point. I think they're an interesting team to look out for this upcoming offseason, whenever that ends up being, because I think between Embiid and Simmons, they're better off getting assets for one of those two guys and building around the other. Personally, I think Simmons would be the smarter guy to build around because of Embiid's injury history and because Embiid is probably closer to his peak value for trade value right now than Simmons is, because Simmons still isn't a shooter. But I think someday Simmons will get to that level. But anyway, I think the Sixers are a little bit of a mess. They're still talented. I could see them winning one playoff series, but they're definitely not a team I want to bet on at all. At number 12, we've got Indiana. Exact same record as Philly. They were 39-26 when the season stopped, on pace for 49 wins, and they've been 3-1 so far in the playoffs, or in the bubble. Indiana did beat Philly. I have Indiana ranked slightly ahead of them. It wouldn't shock me if the Sixers were able to beat Indiana in the first round, but I just think the Pacers have a couple more guys who can kind of kill another team in a first round series. I think Oladipo being back helps. They've been playing without Sabonis so far, so that's been impressive. I think they've got an underrated set of guards. I think Brogdon is pretty good. Aaron Holiday has been good. And they've been playing without Jeremy Lamb so far, but when he comes back, I think he's a pretty good bench point guard. And of course, TJ Warren has been their best player so far, and he's supposed to be, the third best guy, kind of like a role player who can pitch in every now and then. But he's been really good so far, and he's had some really big games, dropping, I think it was like 53 against the Sixers, which, when you hear that, it's like, what is going on with Philadelphia? How can they let that happen with how many guys they have who are good defenders? And then, you watch the game and you just watch how sloppy Philadelphia is. It's like, it just happened. And some of those shots were pretty awesome by TJ Warren as well. But, it's really inexcusable from Philly's perspective. I think the Pacers have a pretty good, well-rounded lineup. I think they'll be frisky in the first round, and I've got them ranked 12th. At 11, this is the 7th ranked team in the Western Conference. I have the Oklahoma City Thunder. So the Thunder were 40-24, on pace for 51 wins when the season stopped. They are 2-2 so far in the bubble. I think the Thunder are a high floor, low ceiling type of team. I think Chris Paul deserves a ton of credit for the way he's rebounded this year. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's been really good. He's been a nice scoring threat for them. Gallinari has had a very nice season. Steven Adams is pretty solid. And Schroeder's been really good off the bench. He's kind of found a new role for himself that I think fits him a lot better than being a starting point guard. And so the Thunder have actually been one of the better stories this year. They've completely outperformed expectations. I didn't see them as a team that would make the playoffs the way they did before the season started. and they deserve a lot of credit. This is a team that is pretty well organized. They are in good hands with a decent coach, and obviously I think Chris Paul kind of brings a sensibility to whatever team he's on, where, he's going to make smart decisions at the point guard position. And of course, the X factor of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander helps them out a lot. I think Oklahoma City winning one playoff series would be probably their ceiling, I think. And I think they would be a second round exit team if that happened. We'll see what ends up happening with them. They've looked really good in moments, and there have been times where it just feels like they're missing another scorer. But overall, I think what they've done is pretty admirable. At number 10, I've got Dallas. They are 40-27, or they were 40-27, on pace for 49 wins when the season stopped. And since then, they've been 1-3 since the bubble started, with some really high scoring and fun games to watch. So I've got Dallas ranked 10th. Honestly, if a couple of those games bounce differently, I think you could make the argument they could be a lot higher. This is a team that I think is going to end up probably as the 7 seed because of the way the records are shaking out. But they're kind of a dangerous 7 seed. I want to see this Mavericks team do well because I love watching Doncic. I think he and Porzingis have been really fun to watch. I don't want to see them get matched up with the Clippers because I think the Clippers have had the Mavericks number this year so far, and I think it's a good matchup for LA. I really wanted to see Dallas get matched up with a team like Denver because I think that Dallas would be like a sneaky upset kind of team if they were matched up with a more fraudulent, higher seeded team. But we'll see if that ends up happening. I'm not sure. The Mavericks are so offensively gifted. I think they're one of the 5 best offensive teams in the league. The problem with Dallas is that defensively, they're a little bit lackluster. They're not always as good as you want them to be. I just feel like with the Mavericks, they're missing like one more piece. I think with Doncic and Porzingis as your top 2 guys, you can go far. I think you can go places with those 2. They actually have some guys who I think are okay as bench players, and I think Seth Curry has been a really good player to kind of throw in and out of the starting lineup as a scoring option. But they could use maybe 1 or 2 more 3-and-D type guys on this team. If they added just, for example, a guy like Robert Covington or a guy like Harrison Barnes, if they got that type of player back for their team, I think they'd be a lot better. I think this team is just a couple tweaks with their roster away from being a really good team in the NBA. I think they could be one of those 5 or 6 best teams in the league. So at number 9, I've got Denver. They were 43-22, on pace for 54.5 wins when the season stopped. They've been 2-2 so far in the bubble. So far, they've been without Jamal Murray, Gary Harris, Will Barton. They have had Jokic and the emergence of Michael Porter Jr., as well as Bol Bol, who actually looked quite good in a couple of the games he was in. So I want to give Denver some credit first because I don't know if this is true for everybody, but I definitely felt like when they drafted Michael Porter Jr. at 14 overall, it just felt like a really smart pick because why not take the risk on a guy who could have been one of the 5 best overall prospects in that class at 14? Why not take the risk, especially for Denver where he wouldn't have to play right away? I was just shaking my head at some of the teams that were passing up on him, like Chicago and Cleveland, and I don't know, it was just kind of bizarre to me that more teams didn't want to take the risk with this high upside player because in the NBA, there's only like 25 players that really matter, and you could get your hands on one of those guys for a real discounted price. It just, to me, it's like, why draft a good role player when you can have this, rangy outcome type of prospect like Michael Porter Jr. And anyway, Michael Porter Jr. has been awesome. His shooting has been really good. It's really been excellent. He looks like a great scorer, improving as a defender. He is the X factor that could make Denver a much better team than I initially thought they were going to be going into this bubble. I still sort of feel like Denver could be upset in the first round, and it wouldn't shock me, but if Michael Porter Jr. continues to play this well, they've also got Jokic, and if some of these other guys come back, like Gary Harris, Jamal Murray, Barton, I think this Denver team is actually really talented, and they've got a really good, interesting, kind of combination of lineups to go with. They're an interesting team. I still do not see them as a threat to win the Western Conference, but this Michael Porter Jr. thing is interesting, and I think that they are in a unique position moving forward. I think they could be a much better team in coming years than they otherwise would have been without this emergence of Michael Porter Jr. At number 8, I've got Portland, surprisingly. So they're in 9th place right now. They are the team that's set to be in the play-in game. When the season stopped, they were 29-37, on pace for only 36 wins. To me, no team has looked more different than the Trailblazers, because since the bubble has started, they've been 3-1. They beat Houston in a thrilling game. They did beat Denver, although the Nuggets were a little bit undermanned. They also beat Memphis, and they barely lost to the Boston Celtics. I've been so impressed with the Trailblazers. They look like a totally different team right now with Nurkic back. I think it's kind of like a dual benefit where Nurkic is inserted into the starting role. He's looked really good. Zach Collins is also back. And then they move Whiteside to the bench. Gary Trent Jr. has been an awesome three-point shooting scorer off the bench so far. And of course, you've got Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum. That's as good of a backcourt as any backcourt in the NBA right now. And I continue to stand behind Lillard. I think Lillard is one of the 7 best players in the league. I think he does a lot more with less than people realize. Lillard is really in a class of his own, along with Steph Curry, really. Just those two who can pull up from anywhere, and teams have to respect it. I also think Lillard just shows up in big spots a lot. He's a guy who I would want on my team, taking that last shot. If the shot clock is running down, I want him in a playoff series. I think he's come up big in a lot of moments. And again, I think he's one of the 7 best guys in the league. Also, McCollum, probably a little bit undervalued across the league. I think he's probably one of the 35 best players in the league, and a lot of people don't really categorize him that way, but he's been really solid too. I think this Portland team is really good. They have impressed me probably more than any other team. I'm really pulling for them to get into the playoffs because, to me, they are by far the most interesting first-round matchup for the Lakers. I think if you're the Lakers, you are hoping that Memphis finds a way to sneak in, that it's just not Portland. Like, if you're the Lakers, it could be anyone other than the Trailblazers, because I think the Trailblazers would actually have some resiliency and make that a series. So this is a team I'm really excited about. I think if the whole season restarted and they had this lineup going, this team would have been like a top 4 team in the West, probably. At least a top 6 team. I think they would have been much higher ranked than where they are right now. At number 7, I've got the Miami Heat. When the season stopped, they were 41-24, on pace for 51.5 wins, and they've been 2-2 so far in the bubble. So I think Miami is a really solid team. I think they're well coached. I just like a lot of their players. So they're not overly dependent on any one guy. You could make the argument that Butler isn't even the best player on this team. Adebayo has been so solid defensively. He has been a revelation offensively. They add these 3-point shooters. Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero have been great. Kendrick Nunn has been a really promising looking bench type point guard. They've been using Dragic a lot, and I really like what Dragic does. I feel like Dragic is one of the most underrated point guards in the league. And so overall, I think this team is really good. They've got depth, and they've got a smart head coach. I think the Heat are, interestingly, the biggest threat to the Bucks, but I don't think the Heat would necessarily make the finals even if they upset the Bucks. So I think the Heat could get outmatched in a series against Boston. I think they could get outmatched in a series against Toronto. But if I'm Milwaukee, I think the one team that I wouldn't want to see in like the second round of a playoff matchup is the Miami Heat. And the reason why is just because the Bucks are, pretty straightforward in what their strategy is. They go as the 3-ball goes, and they also go as Giannis goes. And so I just think if there's one team that could slow down Giannis a little bit, it would be Miami, and the chess piece would be Adebayo. The other thing about Miami is that if they're clicking, they could potentially shoot up to the standards of Milwaukee for any given game. Again, I'm not saying Miami's going to beat Milwaukee. I'm just saying if there's one team that would make Milwaukee seem a little bit vulnerable, it would be Miami. So I think the Heat are in an interesting position. I think they will win a playoff series, and I think they will be competitive in that second round series. They've done a good job of standing up to all the other toughest teams in the Eastern Conference so far, and I'm interested to see how far they go. At number 6, I've got Toronto. When the season stopped, they were 46-18, on pace for 59 wins. They've been 3-1 so far in the bubble. I think Toronto's been awesome. I think Nick Nurse deserves Coach of the Year. They're not overly dependent on any one guy either. I think Siakam and Lowry are probably their two most quality players top to bottom. But they also have other players who can contribute. Van Vliet has been really good as a ball handler, shooter, passer. I think Anunoby has been a pleasant surprise. He's been good defensively, and offensively he's improved as the season has gone on. They've got Norman Powell off the bench. Terrence Davis has been a good player. I think the Raptors have a ton of different chess pieces to use at all times, and I think this team is really solid. It wouldn't shock me at all if Toronto made it to the Eastern Conference Finals. I think they are really solid top to bottom. I would be mildly surprised if they made it back to the NBA Finals, but this is a good team, and they've got a lot of playoff experience on this roster, and they're very well coached. The only downside with Toronto is that in that game against Boston last night, and I'm recording this on August 8th, by the way, they did not look great against Boston, to say the least. They were actually run out of the building in a lot of ways, and that was really surprising because not only were they favored, but I don't know, I thought Toronto would be able to hang with a team like Boston a little bit more. I think the only downside to this team is that maybe when push comes to shove in a matchup with Boston, they might be one scorer short every now and again. They're not quite as offensively gifted as some of the teams ahead of them on this power ranking. At number 5, I've got Houston. They went 40-24 in the regular season before it stopped, on pace for 51 wins, and they've been 3-1 so far in the bubble. I think Houston's got the widest range of outcomes of any team in the league. If they lost in the first round, it wouldn't shock me. But if they went to the Western Conference Finals and competed with one of the LA teams, it also wouldn't shock me. I think the thing that brings me back to Houston a lot, and why I do like this team, is that they've done really well against the other top teams in the league so far. They have gone toe-to-toe with Milwaukee. They've beaten Milwaukee. They've gone toe-to-toe with the LA Clippers. They've also matched up well with the Lakers. I think this team has been a little bit overly criticized. Harden, to me, is one of the 5, maybe 6 best players in the league right now. His efficiency is off the charts. And Westbrook has revitalized his career in a way that I just wasn't expecting at all. I think Westbrook has looked as good in the second half of this season as he has in the past 2 years, which is shocking because a guy so predicated on athleticism over the age of 30 just felt like a recipe for disaster for Russell Westbrook with his decline in shooting. And yet his 2-point field goal percentage has been awesome because they've been spacing the floor and he's just driven really well on a ton of other players around the league. Just continues to get to the basket and hit efficient shots. I also think Daryl Morey deserves a lot of credit. You know, I think a lot of good analysts for the NBA completely overvalue the idea of like a team being big, a team having size, a team having length. You know, I've never really paid much attention to that because I don't think it matters that much. I think small ball has become more and more popular because it's a good way of taking advantage of matchups with certain teams. And the Rockets going with basically a permanent small ball lineup with, you know, Tucker in a lot of instances playing the 5. I just think it makes a lot of sense. And I think you could make the argument that, like, even though Capella was a good player, he held them back at times for what they wanted to do. And I think that the swapping of Capella for Covington made some sense. And so I just think that too many times I'm hearing like, oh, this team's too small. You know, I'm hearing it about the Clippers too. And I just don't really get it. I don't think the bigger you are, the better you are. I think Philadelphia is a walking example of how that does not linearly correlate to being a better team. Or even a better matchup against certain smaller teams. And so the Rockets, to me, have this fireworks show of offense, and they've got tons of three-point shooters. Even some of the depth guys on this team, guys like House and Covington, are good shooters that can, on any given night, help them out. Austin Rivers is another guy who I think is good coming off the bench. I think this Rockets team has the firepower to upset one of the LA teams. I don't know if they have the consistency to win 3 series in a row, but I think that they could be a dangerous team that wins a series that they're not supposed to. Of course, they could also flame out in the first round, perhaps unexpectedly at this point. I think they've got a wide range of outcomes. I'm really interested in seeing what the Rockets look like this year. So at number 4, I've got Boston. When the season stopped, they were 43-21, on pace for 55 wins. They've gone 3-2 so far in the bubble. So I've got Boston 4th. I think they're the second best team in the East. I would tentatively say that. I don't think they're a good matchup against Milwaukee, so I don't think that that's the way they're going to get to the finals if they do. But I think the way this would happen for Boston is if Miami kind of somehow upset Milwaukee, and then Boston fought through Toronto and then beat a team like Miami in the Eastern Conference Finals. It is a long shot, but I think that the Celtics, you know, if you just told me Milwaukee didn't make the NBA Finals this year, I think the team that probably made it is Boston. Even though I don't think Boston probably would have been the team that upset Milwaukee. When you look at the Celtics, and you know, maybe I'm overvaluing how awesome they were last night, but this team has so much scoring. They've got so many different guys who can get you a bucket. They actually remind me a little bit of the Raptors last year. Tatum and Jaylen Brown are these awesome wing defending players who can definitely create their own shots. You could make the argument that Tatum's one of the 15 best guys in the league. Jaylen Brown, you could make the argument, is one of the 30 best guys in the league. To go along with those two, Kemba Walker is still the point guard of this team. He's a very good scorer. He can shoot the three, he can play off the ball. He's versatile. I like Kemba, and I think it's interesting that he's become almost more of an afterthought because of how good Tatum and Brown have been. And then Gordon Hayward, another guy who I think is a little bit undervalued right now. He's a guy that can get them buckets when they need him. And the fact that he's the fourth scoring option on this team, I think, is a really good sign for the Celtics team. To go along with that, their bench is really good. Marcus Smart is a great player to have on a playoff team, does all the little things that you want. Every now and then he'll give you a good offensive play, whether it's a pass or a big shot. I think Tice has been a good solution for them at the 5. I think he has looked really good at times. He can shoot a little bit. He can pass a little bit, and he's been okay defensively. He's had some moments where he hasn't been great, but I think he's been a lot better than Cantor has been top to bottom. So I think the Celtics team is good. They're, of course, well coached also, and I think they've got some upside. It's going to be interesting to see if this young group can put it together. At number 3, I've got the Lakers. They're 49-14, on pace for 64 wins. They were that when the season stopped. They've been 2-3 so far since the bubble started. They lost pretty handily to Oklahoma City as well as Toronto. They also lost to Houston in a game where Houston didn't have Westbrook and the Lakers didn't have LeBron. So Davis versus Harden one-on-one with pretty even rosters on either side. And Harden and the Rockets won by a lot and looked a lot better. So the Lakers have been interesting. I didn't love the way their team was constructed way back before this whole season started. And then as the season went along, they kind of started to win me over. I was always kind of on the Clippers as being better overall than them. And then towards the very end of the regular season before it stopped, there was, I think, a 7 or 10 day stretch where they beat the Clippers as well as the Bucks. And, at that moment I started to think, well, this Lakers team is starting to take over as the best team in the league. And so, interestingly, in the first game of the bubble, they had a really entertaining game that went down to the wire against the Clippers, and the Lakers did end up winning that game. The only bad news is that the Clippers were without Lou Williams, Montrezl Harrell, and Beverly had, I think, limited minutes in that game. When I look at this Lakers team now, it still wouldn't shock me if they won the championship. It wouldn't shock me if they made it to the finals. It still comes down to the top 2 guys for the most part. I'm not overly worried about their 7th or 8th best guy on their roster. It comes down to LeBron and Davis. And those two have been a really good match together so far this year. They've complemented each other really well. I'm a little bit concerned, though, about who the 3rd best scorer is on this team. Because if one of those two, between LeBron and Davis, has an off game, I'm mildly concerned about what other player is going to pick up the slack for them. A lot of people want that player to be Kuzma, but Kuzma has been really inconsistent as an offensive player so far. I think he could have a couple really good games in a playoff series, and he could have a couple no-shows. Maybe you get a couple great games out of Danny Green, but I think there's going to be a bunch of different games where Danny Green is a little bit more invisible. I think not having Rondo is a problem. I think Rondo would have helped stabilize the bench a lot more. I think he would have been a good option for them. And it's unclear if he's going to be ready when the playoffs start. Avery Bradley being gone isn't too big of a deal. I think the signings of Waiters and J.R. Smith are probably good enough to, kind of make up for what Bradley was going to do for this team. But I just don't love this team defensively. I think they're a little bit unreliable outside of their top two guys. I think this roster is a little bit too thin right now. If you really look at their starting, or their crunch time five, as of right now, it looks like Caruso is going to be out there. Maybe it's Danny Green. Maybe it's Kuzma. It's kind of a weird situation that they're in right now. I'm not fully anti-Laker, but I've soured on them a little bit since the season stopped. I thought they looked like the narrow favorites over the Clippers going into this bubble NBA tournament, but they've been underwhelming so far, and I think it's going to be up to those top two guys to help turn things around. At number 2, I've got Milwaukee. When the season stopped, they had the best record in the league, 53-12, on pace for 67 wins. They've only been 2-2 so far since the bubble started. They had an interesting loss to Houston and a loss to the Nets, where the Bucks rested some of their guys in the second half. So this Bucks team has been historically good offensively in the regular season. They're beating teams on average by almost 11 points a game. So that's ridiculous. I mean, this team is really special. Again, I think the team that this Bucks team should be most wary of for a 7-game series is actually Miami. I think Miami is the only team that has the mixture of defense as well as shooting that can kind of hang with this Milwaukee team for a 7-game series. I think Boston is close, but not good enough to win a 7-game series against Milwaukee. I think it is Miami with Adebayo being the X factor. That being the team that could upset this Milwaukee team if they are going to get upset. But the Bucks have a ton of shooting. I've never been too worried about Middleton as the second best player. I just think Giannis is the best player in the league right now. He's the best player in the world. His shooting has gone up. His defense is elite. His scoring is elite. This team will go as Giannis goes. And I think last year, the Bucks ran into Kawhi Leonard and the Raptors, and Kawhi was able to force Giannis to take more shots than he wanted to. And at that time, Giannis was shooting 25-ish% from 3. Now it's up to 30%, which is not great, but certainly an improvement. I don't know if there's a team that's going to be able to stop Milwaukee, interestingly. I like the depth on this team. I think Bledsoe is the right type of point guard you want on a team with Giannis. I think Middleton has been he's just in a really good situation for himself as like a shooter. Brook Lopez has been really good defensively and as a shooter. He's been a great addition to this team. And I think they've got some good bench guys who can pitch in with threes, Even some of the lower ranked guys, DiVincenzo, Korver, Ilyasova, I just think there's just a lot of offense on this team. They've got a lot of different ways to score. And it only takes, a few of those guys to be hot on any given night for them to put up a really big total on the scoreboard. And so I'm not going to discount Milwaukee. I think there's an argument that they could be the favorite. But for right now, I personally have them ranked second. Maybe their inexperience is a little bit of something that's just kind of holding me back from wanting to put them at number 1. But this team is awesome, and I'm interested to see how they perform when the playoffs start. And so that means number 1, I have the Clippers. They were 44-20 when the season stopped, on pace for 56.5 wins. They've only been 2-2 so far since the bubble started. They had kind of a weird loss to Phoenix, and they had that loss to the Lakers on opening night, where the Clippers did not have Lou Williams or Montrezl Harrell. So interestingly, I actually felt like that game against the Lakers almost made me feel more confident in what the Clippers can do, because Montrezl Harrell wasn't there, Lou Williams wasn't there, Beverly was, I think, limited with his minutes in that game, and yet the Clippers went down to the wire with the Lakers. I think this Clippers team is almost doing what the Raptors were doing last year, and this is, all the credit to Kawhi. This team is waiting to play their best defense when it matters most. They're not going to risk getting tired or injured before they have to, when the chips are down. I think the best version of this Clippers team has not been revealed yet. I think this team is still getting better, and this is all a huge credit to Kawhi Leonard. And Kawhi Leonard's done this in San Antonio. He's done this, of course, with Toronto last year. He's so good at allowing his team to peak at the right time. The Clippers aren't afraid of resting Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, or both of those guys along with someone else in any Wednesday night game against Sacramento, because that game ultimately doesn't matter. The Clippers have been really smart about how they've handled their minutes. I think the injuries that Kawhi and Paul George have been nursing over the year have been serious enough to the point where this is helping them. The rest has helped them. And I think they probably more than any other team benefited from the break in play, because they got to rest, nurse their injuries, and this team didn't have that much continuity to begin with because they were always missing games. So now that they're back, they can kind of come together and try to put together the best version of themselves. I think the X factor for this Clippers team, the thing, if things go wrong for them, the thing they need to consider is Paul George going to come up big when he needs to, because he hasn't always done that in his career. And they're going to need him quite badly to be good in a series against LeBron if they're going to beat the Lakers. As much as I like Montrezl Harrell and I like Lou Williams and I like Beverly, those guys might be better than the depth players for the Lakers, but Paul George needs to stand up to the combination of LeBron and Davis if this Clippers team is going to put it together. Ultimately, I think the Clippers have just done a really smart job of pacing themselves. And again, I think you can make the argument Kawhi Leonard has played some of the best basketball of his career this season in terms of efficiency. He's continued to get better. There's a case for him to be the second best player in the league behind Giannis right now. And honestly, with how he handled Giannis last year, there's a case for Kawhi to be the top dog right now. I think it's an interesting playoffs that we're about to enter. I would tentatively say I think the Clippers are probably the team that I trust the most to be ready at the right time. I don't think they're going to run out of gas. And I think it's all because they've paced themselves throughout the year. And I don't think we've seen the best version of this Clippers team yet. So that concludes this episode of the Athletic Acuity Sports Podcast. Thanks for listening.